we go to discussion and questions, etc., just a quick request, really. The organisers and contributors to all these meetings have been volunteers. We have got some costs we have to meet of venues for meetings, some publicity costs, etc. So if you've got any money, if you're earning a wage, if you feel you can contribute, that would be great. And I think Simon is going to pass around something. So while the discussion is going on, as I say, only if you're able, that would be great. So thanks very much. And also, we have a list. If you haven't already put your name down on the list, if you want to know about future events, please do. Name and contact, email, phone, whatever you want. Okay, so thanks very much. So there's an awful lot in there to think about and talk about. And we really would like to encourage as much participation as possible. So please don't hold back if there are questions. And I will call people generally who haven't spoken before people get the second time to ask a question or make a comment. Okay, so I hope that's all right. So if we could start. Okay. Yes, one. Go ahead. And we'll take a few at a time. Okay, so. Okay, I can see. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you for your talk. I just wanted to ask, you mentioned that in South London they were thinking of a new way of living right now, and I was wondering how much do you know about that, and could you expand on that, because I find that quite interesting. Also, I was wondering how much do you know about Ted Brown within the gay liberation?
Sorry, about what?
Ted Brown?
Ted Brown.
No? Okay.
Ted Brown was one of the few black people in gay liberation.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, we'll come back to those.
Okay.
Next person. Yeah, you go ahead.
2 points. You know me. The first one is there were earlier riots, actually. I mean, you mentioned one earlier riot, Stonewall. And some of the earlier riots, I mean, Stonewall became the famous one, but there were other ones before, even in New York. And some of them made much more explicit links with the Black Panthers. I mean, they would actually march from the Greenwich Village into another part of town and join up with the Black Panthers and march. So the connection between black liberation and gay liberation was more explicit even than it was in Stonewall, in fact, and that's something interesting. The other point would be, there's a fourth myth, which I like, which you referred to, which is that we all have to thank heaven and all the nightclubs for being nice to us gay people, and look what they've done for us, and that's why they should run Pride. You know, in 1982, I tried leafleting gay clubs to advertise gay pride and was thrown into the street. The idea that the gay scene in the 70s and 80s was in any way supportive of gay liberation was a complete myth. They said explicitly, stop making a fuss, you're making it bad for the rest of us, keep quiet, if you keep quiet they'll leave us alone, which is obviously not true. And so it took a while, it took till, eventually, once they discovered the gay pride marches, they pretended it was theirs, and they dominated completely, and now it's a huge money-making event for the commercial gay scene. It wasn't always that way.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, one more, and then Colin can come back. Okay.
Just a comment. I mean,
Which one was you? Come on.
Wherever we thought of Maoism, the Gay Liberation Front was actually founded by 2 Maoists at the London School of Economics. Well, what I'm impressed by is that the people, in the riots at Stonewall, they weren't highly politicised people. They were people who'd been driven down to the very lowest level and had enough. And it took an incredible, astonishingly brave thing to do, to take on the police and the mafia and all the hostility that surrounded them. Because even when they went to bars near to the Stonewall with so-called radicals, Greenwich Village, alternative radical type people, they wouldn't support them. They wouldn't even go, join in with the rioting, or at least give them any kind of support. But in terms of alternative living, in Brixton, we established the first ever gay community centre on Railton Road, which actually acted as a magnet for other gay people to come into the area and squat several houses, back-to-back houses. So if I want to talk about that later, maybe I won't do it now because it's a big it's quite a big topic, but I'll do it later.
Okay, thanks very much. Do you want to come back at all, or do you want to take some more?
See the comrade first, because he put his hand up.
Okay, yeah.
I just wondered why you didn't mention, for instance, Anthony Gray. Because he did a long, hard slog to get rid of the 1865 Act. That was a hard slog of 11 years. I wonder why you couldn't mention the name of Aubrey Walters and David Fernbach and Bev Jackson and several others who founded the Gay Liberation Front. Yes, there are other things too. Well, for instance, you didn't mention the Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1970, to which Huey Newton organised and then invited women's liberation and gay liberation to attend the conference. Or Bayard Rustin, who, as Martin Luther King's right-hand man, the one who organised the demonstrations in the southern states of America, and the March on Washington, who told Martin Luther King to get rid of the guns in the house and to follow Mahatma Gandhi in peaceful protest. All these led up to Stonewall and after. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. You want to respond to comments?
Sure.
Oh, you could say one other thing. You never mentioned the Drag Queens Commune in Notting Hill, which was very influential in GLF. In fact, it was the major force by 1972, ignoring Mr. Weeks's various attacks on them.
Okay.
Okay, I mean, I think, one of the things that becomes clear from what the comrade is saying is how rich a history this is. I was aware that I was sort of getting towards 45 minutes and that Liz had told me I had 40. There are so many things that one could, there are so many things that one could talk about and, people you could mention. In terms of, I very much like to hear Ian talk about his experience in Brixton. But I mean, there's a book by Stuart Feather who was involved in that, and who speaks about people rented a house together. This was the bit of GLF which I think described themselves as the radical drag queens.
Stuart Feather, and it was David Fernbach who was exploring radical feminism at the time, but they were too exhausted at trying to put on a bit of makeup and a bit of drag, and so they gave up their Maoist examination of radical feminism and retreating from it. They labelled us as the radical feminists, and we said, no, we're feminists, yes, but we're men. So we're not taking that title, so we'll take the radical, and we'll call ourselves radical queens.
Okay, thank you, comrade. Okay. So the idea was, as I understand it, that in the communal houses that people would share everything, that they kept their money in a teapot, that people wore whatever clothes were there when they got up, and this had the effect of abolishing the distinction between men's clothes and women's clothes, because if there were, you just put on whatever clothes were there. If you were a man and there were only, what were thought of as women's clothes, that's what you wore. And so on. And they lived quite close to a school. They got into debates with the school students. They got into some conflict with the school students. But there was there was lots of taking drugs. There was lots of political activity, and that people went and involved themselves in all kinds of protests. And there is the account of going to. I didn't mention. How could I not mention? You see all these things I didn't mention. There's there was a thing called the Festival of Light, which was a right-wing Christian thing involving Cliff Richard, and they had a big thing at Westminster Hall, and GLF went and protested it in this incredibly creative way. So they got a member of theirs to work in the office and pretend she was a devout Christian, and she sold all these tickets to GLF members. And then they all went down in drag and pretended to be respectable ladies. And so one of them would stand up and start saying that they'd been saved and it was wonderful, and the stewards would cotton on this wasn't genuine and hoik them out. And then somebody would unfurl a banner saying Cliff for Queen. And they were removed. And then it became clear that those nuns weren't actually nuns. And that actually not all of them were women. And so on. And then some mice were released. And so on. And so this just destroyed the whole thing in this completely delightful way. And so on. I mean, just to respond to Ray's point. I mean, there are all kinds of links. There was this area of San Francisco called the Tenderloin, where there was money available, I think, as part of what was called the War on Poverty, which was mainly, or which was seen as, because of the racialized nature of poverty in the States, was seen as money for black areas. But you had gay activists applied for money there. They did street campaigning to argue that there was there was this deprivation in the area. They marched into the meeting where the decision was to be made about the money, singing "We Shall Overcome," which I think is perhaps unfortunate, given that it was a civil rights song and it felt like they were nicking it. But there were all of these links that people made, I think, between different kinds of struggles, and I think perceived themselves as part of different parts of one movement.
Okay, right. Anybody who hasn't made a point or asked a question? Yep.
I was really struck by that quote by that Lord
Yes.
of the
Aaron.
decriminalisation of gay sex.
Mm.
And what interested me was, I wanted to ask you what parallels you can draw between that and the establishment now and the legalisation of gay marriage, for instance.
Okay, thanks very much. Anybody else who hasn't asked a question? Yep, go ahead.
We're quite interested to know more about the confluence between gay liberation activity and Maoism. Like, given that there's quite a lot of comments about Maoists starting various aspects of the movement or like being involved. Obviously, Maoism was like a big part of the Black Panthers. Like, they would all read or anything like that at the same time. And I suppose it was just quite widespread in the 70s, including in the West. But I was just kind of interested in like whether that informed their strategic decisions, or like whether there was internal disputes about like whether this was like an appropriate revolutionary ideology to structure their struggle. I'm just interested to hear any more about that.
Great. Okay, thanks very much. Should we take one more? Anybody else? Yep, back there.
Yeah, I would like to ask about California actually, because right now when you go there, it seems like they have an almost like there's.
Can you hear her?
Sorry,
We can't really hear up here. Sorry. Perhaps stand up. Sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about California, like before the gay liberation movement, because right now it seems like a perfect place with Castro, with Pride, with legacy of Harvey Milk, and yeah, what happened to make it actually like that? Like what happened before, as you mentioned, that gay sex was like illegal for a long time as well, and so that's the first one. And the second question I have is, I think that like gay rights are now, of course, part of culture, but part of capitalist culture as well. So if you could comment on that a little bit.
Right, thanks very much. Okay, 3 good points.
Okay. On Maoists, I mean, I think that the starting point, certainly, of Maoist politics in the, well, I think you have to say that Maoism splits from Stalinism, or is a variant of Stalinism, and Stalinism had rejected the kind of tradition that there was at the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917, which had sought to liberate women, which had abolished laws against homosexuality. So homosexuality is recriminalised in Russia in 1933. And women are getting medals for having large numbers of children, and so on. So that's Stalinism, and I think that Maoism didn't break from that. I mean, the American left certainly was appalling at times. There was a protest against Nixon's inauguration in '68, where women from Women's Liberation got onto the platform, though they were right at the end of the speakers. And this woman begins to speak, and people in the crowd shout, "Take her off the stage and fuck her." And the people who were running the rally didn't do anything about this. So there was an appalling level, I think, of sexism and of homophobia. And I mean, the other aspect of Stalinism was, of course, Cuba, because many people on the American left imagined that this was what socialism was like. So you had this tradition of people going to Cuba as a gesture of solidarity to cut sugarcane for the revolution. They were called Venceremos brigades. There was a gay Venceremos brigade who went over and got treated like shit. So that then meant there were all of these debates in gay liberation about its relationship to the left, what socialism looked like, workers and so on. I mean, I think it's in Come Together, there is a comment about how we went to the trade union demo, even though most people on it were sexist straight men and therefore our enemy. So there is this idea that macho straight men are the enemy, rather than, seeing them as people who could be won over, which is, I think, the great advantage of, if a group like Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners, is that they actually assumed, or they hoped, that they could win the miners over, and were able to do so because they had things in common with gay people, even if they didn't start out from that position. So there are all of these difficulties and sort of complications of the relationship with the left. I mean, the people were asking also about the situation today, and I think that certainly there has been now a situation where the thing that is most striking to me is that you have now people who are in major positions of power in society, the Commissioner of Metropolitan Police, the Chief Executive of Apple, and so on and so forth, who are out lesbians and gays, which was absolutely unthinkable at the time. I mean, you had no rights in the workplace. It wasn't clear if you could be a teacher. It was very doubtful you could be a teacher, or a lawyer or something like that. So this emergence of what you could call the lesbian and gay ruling class is new. And of course, on the one hand, you welcome something like the Equality Act, but on the other hand, I think that there are many people left out of that. You look at how, refugees, for example, are treated, that you have Home Office officials asking for proof that they are gay. Well, what kind of proof does anyone have? Or saying, can't you just go back to your country of origin and live discreetly? Or maybe you could get married, but what? You're supposed to, you're supposed to marry, you're supposed to have a cross-sex marriage for the rest of your life. What's that like? So, so I think that there are so many people who are left out of this kind of happy neoliberal story about, we're all of us equal before the law, and I still think that we need, many changes, because, you look, for example, at funding for healthcare for trans people. It's like my point that you can't separate LGBT liberation from broader struggles, and that, we need a fully funded health service. We shouldn't have people waiting, for a very long time for healthcare. We should have benefits which enables people to live in places where they feel comfortable. My impression is, for example, lots of LGBT people, want to live in LGBT areas, but the fact that people can't do that on benefit means people are forced out to the suburbs or forced out to places, where they don't feel happy. So you can't separate these issues. I'm not sure, or I think I disagree about where marriage fits into that, because I think that you have to have equality, and so that if straight people can marry, then we have to have the right to marry. I don't think that marriage is enough. I certainly think that there is a sort of, now there is this kind of, now we're all encouraged to go and live in the suburbs and have kids and have a Labrador. And if I see one more picture of, oh God, how do you pronounce his name? Pete Buttigieg, of him and his lovely husband who are about to adopt a baby, and therefore you should vote for him as President of the United States, though he has no politics at all, basically because he's gay. And you get this in the LGBT media all the sodding time. You can tell it winds me up. So it's both. So it's both things like that. It's recognising that things have moved forward, but that it doesn't apply to everybody, and we need more than what we've got.
Was there a question about California as well?
About California, California. On the one hand, you have places like San Francisco, which had always been a kind of refuge. I think that's because, partly, for the same reason as New York, which was because people who were coming back from the armed forces abroad and couldn't go back to the Midwest would stay there. You have Harvey Milk starts to organise in the mid-70s. Milk also makes links with the unions. One of his first campaigns is to get Coors beer out of the gay bars because Coors is an anti-union company. When Milk is assassinated, in I think 79, someone correct me if I'm wrong, and there is then the trial of the guy who shot him, who gets an extremely light sentence, former cop, who shot Harvey Milk. And then there is this riot in San Francisco, and if you read Cleve Jones's memoir, they marched out of the Castro down to City Hall. They broke every window on the ground floor of City Hall. They set fire to the cop cars one by one, in Jones's memorable phrase. So, that's, that's the kind of way that I think things changed in California, not through Nancy Pelosi and and so on, and so on, and so on and so forth. So I guess that's. But certainly you're right that there is now this kind of assimilation, integration in this ambivalent way.
Okay, thanks very much, Colin. Okay, next round. Okay, yeah.
You mentioned lesbianism a bit, so I just wondered.
Sorry, can't hear.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Stand up if you would.
Sorry about this.
I'm old and deaf.
Okay. You mentioned lesbianism a bit, but I was just wondering why it wasn't regulated to the same extent as relations between gay men, and why we also, if that's the case, and then maybe is it less threatening? I just wondered what you thought about it.
Yeah. Okay.
really interesting talk. A few talks ago we heard from Lindsay who talked about the women's liberation movement in the 1960s, and there was a comrade there that evening who talked about transitioning in the 1960s and about her exclusion as a trans woman from the feminist movement, but also she mentioned that she'd been asked not to go back to a GLF meeting because it was like, I think what she said was that she'd been told they were trying to sort of build a more respectable movement. I just wondered whether there was a shared perspective on trans liberation within the movement, or whether it was kind of like isolated, and perhaps that was an isolated incident, or whether different groups had different kind of perspectives on it.
Thanks very much. Okay, one more? No? Okay, we'll take those then, Colin.
Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, didn't see. Oh, yes, I'm sorry.
Just very briefly, you said nothing about the lesbian separatist movement, and I know there's a ton of stuff you haven't talked about, but I just think that's a very interesting group in terms of what's going on. I wonder if you have any thoughts.
Okay, right.
Okay. Why wasn't lesbianism illegal? There was a proposal in the 20s in Britain that sex between women should be against the law, and there is, I can't find the quote, but off the top of my head, or you know, from memory, there's this member of the House of Lords, when it gets to the House of Lords, says you can't do this because this will let women know that it's possible. So, you know, it's like women's sexuality is different from men's sexuality. One of the main ways that women's sexuality was policed is that, like, you know, respectable women don't have sexual feelings. It's sort of part of the picture. So to actually make lesbianism illegal would be, in some sense, to take women's sexuality seriously. And they always felt that the best way of coping with that would be to silence it, rather than to actually acknowledge it, if you like. I mean, it was always the case, part of what the American state did in the 50s was to investigate. There were extraordinary investigations in the armed forces into accusations, I suppose you have to say, of lesbian relationships. And these were quite different from, because, I mean, men who had sex with men were kicked out of the army. But the only people who were kicked out, the only people who were investigated, were the people who had actually done the sexual acts. What you get with lesbianism in the American Armed Forces is that there's this whole anxiety about, it isn't just about sexuality more closely defined, it's about supportive relationships between women. So you get women sort of questioned who have, you know, you gave so-and-so a present, you went on holiday together, and you get dozens, sometimes hundreds of women drawn into these investigations in army camps, in ways which, I mean, you can't say that it's, I guess, worse or better than gay men, but it was in some ways far more distressing for the women involved, because the gay men were simply told, right, you know, you've done this, you're out. Whereas the women were like, everything that they did was sort of questioned, and there's endless questioning, and so on. So, I mean, there you do get an acknowledgement, and you know, you get and so on. And I think that the other thing that happens in terms of lesbians is that initially, my understanding is certainly in Britain, the women's liberation movement is ambivalent and sometimes hostile towards lesbians, but that after there is a women's liberation conference at Skegness at the miners' holiday camp in, I think, 72 or 73.
71.
71, okay. And in fact, there again now, because the platform there is controlled by the Maoists. And the Maoists don't want to talk about lesbians, but the lesbians stand up and say, no, we should talk about this. And they basically, take over the agenda of the conference. So from that point on, the women's liberation movement is much more open to lesbians. And you have the various strands within women's liberation, one of which, I guess, is what's called radical feminism, which, is people, people like Shulamith Firestone, who, whereas Marxists, in a sort of crude version of Marxism, think that the key struggle in society is about class, and that's the only thing that matters. I think Shulamith Firestone kind of rewrites Marxism and makes a struggle between sort of monolithic blocks of men and women into the key to understanding society. Or certainly that's how radical feminism develops later. But I mean, there is an awareness on the part of radical feminists that the whole of society has to change. Radical feminists are the people who begin initially talking about child sexual abuse, who talk about rape, and so that it isn't just about the issues that socialists find it easier to talk about around equal pay, for example, and so radical feminists, radical lesbians are talking about some of the difficulties which many women, both lesbian and straight women, are acknowledging that they have in personal relationships or in their personal interactions with men, and straight women are talking about the difficulties that they have in sexual relationships with men. So that there's, I think, an enormous amount of stuff which maybe is now talked about a bit more, comes out of lesbian feminism. And the final question was about trans people. My understanding is that there were debates and disagreements, that there were some trans people, but then, I mean, we've seen lots of people wearing drag. The words we use now don't quite work because someone like Marsha P. Johnson, we would now perhaps call a trans woman, but he, I'm not sure, used the word drag queen to describe themselves. I'm going to hedge and use them. So there are those discussions. So I mean, I remember a friend of mine went around in the early 80s wearing a skirt and got abused in the street, and we identified what was happening to him as homophobia. There wasn't the word transphobia. That kind of came along later, and there was a way of thinking about trans as a political issue, which I don't think happened till the 1990s. But there were, on the one hand, there were some people who did identify as trans women who argued that they should be involved in GLF Women's Organisation. There were some feminists in those spaces who objected to that. There were, as I understand it, some feminists who accepted that. But I mean, certainly in broader society, my impression, thinking back to when I came into the movement in the 1980s, is that there were just a lot fewer trans people. And so the kind of thing we have now, where it's an issue which is very widely discussed and many people know trans people, it just wasn't like that then. So so I don't know how widespread a debate it was.
Right. Okay. Thanks very much. Yep. Okay.
Could I add something? I've hesitated because I was a radical separatist, but didn't necessarily have a wonderful life as a lesbian. But I just, and I was recommending the lesbian history book, that's some of the information that you want. And I we were part of a much wider sort of subculture. There were whole areas of London where there were empty houses and we moved in and squatted. So if you wanted to live with just women, you could do that. The first person I knew to transition was in about 1973. Still around, Valerie Remy. Never attempted to get into the women's movement. Never tried to say that they should go to a women-only space. Always sort of more in the gay movement space that was made. But all these boundaries were much more fluid in those days, I feel. I mean, there was something that we used to call the straight left, which didn't mean that it was heterosexual. It probably meant that they were Marxists, and we were probably, in a way, kind of anarchist, but hadn't theorised it particularly, and often used to not walk, and often used to do things with the Marxists anyway, you know, and all these different groups. At one point, you know, the Maoists would vehemently. There was one sect of Maoists which was vehemently homophobic. There were others who weren't at all and who saw it as a kind of, you know, and I can remember Carol, another person who transitioned, probably Dave Carroll, was part of a women's liberation Maoist kind of band, musicians. There was a lot of cultural stuff. I'm trying to remember it all, but only 2 nights ago I was at a meeting about Curious King's Cross, and I remembered all the squats around there, and the very first women's self-examination group in England, as far as I know, in one of those squats. A lot of people that you've mentioned now, Lynn Seagull and Alison Fell, a lot of people. And certainly it was a lesbian separatist scene.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, you're not finished.
Some of us were just, but what I noticed, I remember going to a GLF meeting, and in a way, the Maoists or the Marxists had a kind of elite attitude, but there were lots of people there who were driven because of things that they'd suffered in their lives. And I feel that very much drove me into separatism. And so, although I didn't feel I had fully fledged revolutionary politics and was often quite, I sort of advanced leftwards in a crab-wise direction. Basically, because I was too unhappy with what was mapped out for me as a woman, and didn't feel I could be that. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, yeah.
One of the other contexts for this is what was at the time loosely described as counterculture, or I suppose it's sort of sometimes, you know, trying to be derisively referred to as hippies. But the sort of the huge shift in generational attitudes towards things like how men should dress, how women should dress, which sort of went along with the idea of cultural living, how we talked about people squatting, the idea of communal living, cultural living, much wider than simply, you know, much wider, and fed into a much wider sort of sense of rejection of straight society in your sense of straight, and that I think was one of the that was a key part of the soil in which the GLF was able to grow up. That all of a sudden people starting to say there is something fundamentally wrong with this sort of 50s conformist culture, and that opened up that more accurately, that kicked in a few doors which GLF were able to walk through. I mean, not without opposition. There was some horrendous sexism in amongst the counterculture, and it was something that had to be fought. But you know, again, the other thing was the blossoming of the underground press. You know, most big American cities, and actually significant numbers of British cities as well, would have an underground paper, a left paper of sorts, which again was an open place for the small adverts, for gay clubs to advertise, for all that sort of thing.
Right. Okay, thanks. Right, the young man behind, yeah.
So everyone is talking about 1960s. I'm a younger person, so and it's all very interesting. I really appreciate all of this. It's like, the gentleman over there said he was in the pits, and I was like, wow, he's actually in the years ago, Antifa, I think Braintree came to my uni, James Cleverly, Conservative MP, yeah, he came to give a talk, and one of the things, because he was talking to young people, he kind of tried to advertise the Conservative Party to young people and asked us why it is that young people don't really like the Conservative Party. He brought up a lot of points while we were going. One of the main points that he brought up was the legalisation of gay marriage in 2013. And I wanted to hear your point, your view on why they did that. They went from a party which was very homophobic to a party that was very proud in the fact that they legalised marriage. I've had a lot of arguments saying it was a major political move in order to make them seem like more socially liberal. I've also heard an economic argument as well. So like, one of my old teachers told me that the Conservatives saw the idea that gay marriage would ideally be, well not ideally, but typically be something that only middle class people took part in. So it was kind of seen as an economic or cultural thing. So I just wanted to, what do you think?
Right, great. Thank you very much. Thanks. Okay, do you want to respond, Colin?
Okay. Well, let's start with gay marriage. Why did the Tories change? I mean, they did change. I mean, you know, Norman Tebbit and Thatcher and so on were just simply homophobic, and then they went for gay marriage. I think that, I mean, one thing that there is that there has been this general change in attitudes to sexuality. That the attitude, certainly into the 1960s, was that, you know, we're in favour of marriage, we're in favour of the family, and sexuality in general, I mean, is okay within marriage, but sex outside of marriage is corrosive of the family, and sexuality as a whole is suspect. You know, people used to talk about premarital sex. No, this concept doesn't make sense anymore. I remember the Daily Mail asking why, when Rowan Williams was Archbishop of Canterbury, why didn't he condemn premarital sex more than he did? And he said it was his honest belief that no young person had ever thought, I'd like to have sex, but the Archbishop of Canterbury wants to stop. So perhaps it wasn't worth his while. But you know, that's how things used to be. You know, I mean, all of these campaigns of the 50s and 60s with bishops and so on and so forth. So sexuality was very suspect. And then in the 60s and 70s, you know, people in the women's movement and the gay movement open up attitudes, you know, to sexuality, you know, I mean, the kind of thing Amanda's talking about with women examining their own bodies and so on, which hadn't been done before, and people being open about being gay. And I think that it came that sexuality didn't seem so much of a threat, that people continued to get married and live in families and have children. I mean, I do think that one huge change that I've seen in my lifetime is the change for straight people from the expectation of lifelong monogamy to serial monogamy being absolutely acceptable. I mean, I remember when, you know, when I was growing up, I was born in 61, so I can remember in the early 70s, you know, there was this, you know, there was discussion of, there was this phrase, a child from a broken home. You know, is that if your parents were divorced, that was awful, and you were going to be really messed up by it, and it was a disaster for you. People are laughing because, you know, now everybody, you know, lives like this. You know, but it came to be accepted as the norm for straight people that you would have a series of long-term relationships, and that was just how people lived, and it wasn't a sign that you were, you know, inferior or messed up or anything. And so
changes to divorce law as well.
Yes.
Was simultaneous.
Yes,
That was
exactly.
in the late 60s, wasn't it?
67, I think. Okay, so there's all of these things happening. So I think that the concept of the family changes, and it becomes one that same-sex couples potentially can be part of, because sexuality isn't any longer suspect. And I think basically what they've always wanted to do is reinforce the family. And they've switched from seeing LGBT people as an inherent threat to the family to thinking maybe we can incorporate these LGBT people into the family. And that's and they're more likely to think that because, of course, there's been the whole shift in attitudes away from homophobia, and so it's now much harder for them to take the old homophobic attitude. And I think that also there is this kind of neoliberal thing. There is this kind of neoliberal version of... We used to talk, when this was a thing the left did, about fighting oppression. We used to talk about oppression. Now there's this concept of diversity, which is just, we'll have all different people from all different groups, and so on. But without acknowledging that there is actually any systematic disadvantage going on between these different groups. And so, you get arguments like, you want to have lesbians and gay people working for your company because it's good for business, because diverse companies make more profits or something, and all of those kind of arguments. So I think that's how the Tories, and they were aware that they were, in Theresa May's phrase, seen as the nasty party, and they wanted to detoxify themselves a bit. And I think even attitudes among Tories had, shifted a bit. I mean, it's all a bit unreliable. I mean, who was the Tory who, as soon as they were sort of pushed a bit over LGBT sex lessons in schools, well, no, I shouldn't say sex lessons. They weren't about sex. They're about different kinds of families. But as soon as it was Andrea Leadsom, wasn't it, who started wobbling about, maybe children shouldn't be exposed to homosexuality that young, and you're like, so they're still a bit dodgy. But I mean, I think that's how it changed, if that makes any sense. The other thing, which is the thing about the cultural thing. It's like my mum went out in Sheffield with me in the pram, she told me, and she had just given birth, and for some reason her fingers swelled up and it was painful to wear rings, so she took off her wedding ring. She's a woman with a baby in a pram without a wedding ring, and people noticed, and she got nasty looks. And this is 61 in Sheffield, and so the way that things, the 60s were just shocking. I remember my gran. What I mean is, people found them shocking. I remember my gran. The idea that men could have long hair. The idea that you couldn't distinguish between men and women using the length of their hair. My gran, explained that she had found it very confusing, and she had hit on the method of looking for breasts. Because there was this assumption. There was just this assumption that people have seen episodes of Mad Men. That's kind of what it was like, and then that all started to break down, and it was broader than gay stuff. I mean, if people want to, there was the school kids issue of Oz. There was a Little Red School Book, which were these publications which were talking about sex for school students. Because the sex and relationships education that there was in schools was lousy. There were changes because of the availability of the pill, which comes in the early 60s. And that was kind of contradictory because, on the one hand, it gave women more freedom to experience their sexuality and experience sexual pleasure without the fear of pregnancy, or straight women. But on the other hand, that meant that the experience some women had was that now straight men would say to them, well, you've no reason not to say no because you can't get pregnant because you're on the pill. So it was, so lots of things were changing in that way. But if you think about, somebody like David Bowie made an enormous difference with the way that he appeared, and that he was ambiguous about his sexuality, and that he wore makeup and so on. It was the first time that men had done that. So there were all of these aspects of the counterculture, which and then, as Amanda says, there was what you could call the straight left, and then I suspect there were lots of people who had positions somewhere between them. I think that covers.
Yeah, I think it does. Yes,
Cool.
We'll take a few more, okay? But I think you must be wearing out. Okay, so 1, 2. I'll see if there's anybody else, okay, and then I'll take you. But first, yeah.
Hi, I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit on the role and contributions of bi people and the gay liberation activities and white people, and also about experiences of biphobia from within and without.
Okay, who was? Yeah.
Yeah, I really liked at the start of the presentation when you laid out the myths that enabled the homophobic society kind of to persist throughout the 50s, which then the movement kind of smashed various myths in the 60s and 70s. I was wondering if you could posit what current myths and assumptions underpin the current conjunction or whatever, and what needs to be smashed to enable more space to be opened up.
Go. It's in an unfortunate place. Okay. Anybody else before? Okay, carry on.
Thank you, because actually my question leads on beautifully from yours, because I was going to ask, and this might not be for people on the panel, it might be for somebody in the room who's younger than me, because I am fascinated by and love this new movement, this new wave of our new understanding of gender and sexuality. And I wonder what has driven that. It seems to be a huge explosion in discussion and understanding. And you talked about raising consciousness, some kind of collective consciousness being raised in the late 60s. And I feel like that's happening now, and I wonder what is driving that.
Right. Interesting question. Okay, Colin, do you want to come back on those?
Oh, okay. I think that on the question about bi people in organisation, the concept, the last thing that gay liberation was about equality with straight people. The last thing that people wanted was to fit into society as it currently existed, or certainly this was the attitude among GLF. So the implication of it, so it isn't just that, people did want equality, but there was the idea that all of the categories were to be thrown up in the air as regards sexuality. Gay was this kind of, there was a large element of utopianism, I think, and that gay was something that, as if everybody was going to be gay, as if, men and women were going to abandon fixed gender roles, were going to abandon fixed sexualities, that phrase from New York GLF, we are going to be what we are. And so the effect of that, I think, was that, and certainly if you read if you read Mario Miele's book, which Pluto have republished, and I think under the title Homosexuality and Communism, that's very much his attitude. That is that everything is going to change. So you don't get so much of the kind of common sense understanding of human sexuality where people fit into categories straight and bi and gay. It's just kind of all in flux. That's all right, but then you do also need to acknowledge the existence of people. And I don't know, there are some people here who were around at the time. Certainly from what I've read, you don't come across that much. Certainly, there isn't that much specific organising by people. I think I think the stage it's at is much more the people talking about same-sex desire, because that hasn't been talked about. There are, there's the occasional example. I think somebody in one of, I think there was a bi person in one of the communes, but I mean, certainly it doesn't come up a lot, is what I'm saying in the stuff that you read from the period, and I'm trying to think why. What myths are there at the moment? I think the big myth is that it's all okay now. And we've got equality and we've got liberation, and it's not a problem anymore. And you look at the stuff, you look at the stuff from Stonewall about the levels of the levels of abuse in schools and the levels of mental health problems that people have, the horrific oppression of trans people, the number of trans school students facing death threats, and so on. And I think it's very clear that there's still a lot to be done. And I think it's almost that, I know somebody who works for Friend, the counselling organisation, LGBT counselling organisation, and they said that it could actually, people came to them saying, why am I unhappy? Yeah. Why doesn't my life work? Because I'm supposed to have everything. You see all these images in gay magazines of, I'm supposed to have a lovely husband and a lovely flat and a lovely job, and all of those pictures of Tom Daly and whatever he's called in their gorgeous apartment, with their gorgeous surrogate child. There's a whole debate, very dubious. I just think renting out women's uteruses is a dodgy thing to do, to be perfectly honest. Or at least something that one needs to think carefully about. And you don't even see the goddamn woman in the pictures. Anyway, so there's this. There's a layer of. I think it is largely to do with class. Well, it's to do with race as well, but it's white middle-class gay men who are doing all right, and but that's not everybody, and even for them, why are so many people from that particular demographic doing chemsex and stuff like that? Because there is a psychological toll of being told over and over again that you're inferior, or that So I think there's all of this stuff once you start to look into it. And the stuff about radicalisation at the moment, well, I'm 57, so I'm hardly in a position to talk about what young people's experience is, but it does seem to me, compared with my own experience, that, is that in terms of people looking for housing, or people looking for jobs, or the wages that people can get when they find work, we've had wages plateauing for about 10 years now. There are lots of very kind of solid material reasons why society as it is isn't delivering for people, let alone the stuff about climate or what have you. And I think that it's really not surprising that an increasing number of people are looking around and saying, no, we need an alternative to this. And not just that we need, is that we need some small changes, which maybe the Tories could deliver, but, the idea of living in a completely different way, which seems to me to be what the Extinction Rebellion people are talking about, that starts to come onto the agenda again the way that it did in the 60s, or at least I hope so.
Right, thanks. Fascinating evening. Thank you so much, Colin, and thanks everybody who's come along. Can I just make a couple of announcements, and then other people do too? The next in our series is actually the women's movement in the 1960s. It's going to be opened by Sue Brewley, who was active in the women's liberation movement in London. She specialises in women in 20th century Britain as a historian. It's on the 16th of May, and starting at 7, so a little bit later, in the Darrell Ford Seminar Room, which people who've been to some of the previous discussions will know. It's the Anthropology Building on 14 Taverton Street. Is that right? Yes?
Why did you starting at 7?
I don't know.
The very last talk in the series is starting at 7. But
well, this is 7 as well, according to this website. Okay?
This is the guy that knows. Okay, fine.
I think it's 7 o'clock. I think that's it. Okay, so that's it.
Registration is open.
It's on the website, yeah.
And on Facebook, but I'll send around an email.
Right, so if everybody's given in their details, that's great. Also, sorry?
Part of University College London.
University College London, sorry, UCL.
It's at UCL?
Yes. So it's the Anthropology Building, which is 14 Taverton Street. So it's not far away, just south of the Euston Road. So it's the same general neighbourhood. And there are a couple of talks after that too, which...
Right, so after that we have 2 more talks of what has just been a fantastic series, second fantastic series. This is the first one on social history of the Russian Revolution. On Thursday the 30th of May at 6:30, Brett de Smet from the University of Ghent is going to come and talk about revolutionary change in Egypt in the 50s, 60s and 70s. And he's a historian who's studied that subject. We hope that'll be at SOAS, but we will let people know via social media and via the Social Histories 1960s you can find on the web, and Duncan is also sending out emails and so on if you signed that sheet tonight. The final talk is at 7 on Tuesday the 2nd of July, and that is Black Power and Gender in the United States in the 1960s, and that's Robin Spencer, a historian from the States, and we have agreed with her to sort of break into her tour, which she's touring around, funded by a university, and we have got her to agree to interrupt that schedule and come and talk to us on Tuesday the 2nd of July, and that'll be the last talk, and that is also in UCL.
Yeah, the same place, the Taverton Street. Yeah, okay, thanks, Simon. Okay, again, thanks everybody. If anybody wants a drink or to continue...
Can I make an announcement?
Of course you can make an announcement.
Thank you very much. The Gay Liberation Front is working at the moment on a couple of things. One is the militarisation of Pride and BA Systems funding Pride in Surrey. What goes with the militarisation of Pride is we have a group called No Pride in War, and it started when we objected to the red arrows flying over Gay Pride in 2016. Along with what the Ministry of Defence is doing, is they have a campaign of creating prides in every town and village in the country, not gay pride, but pride in the town. It's a way of sort of discrediting gay pride, and it goes hand in hand with establishing cadet forces in the local school. So that means that there is an increase in homophobia and bullying in schools, which comes out of the cadet forces. So these things we're protesting. There's a meeting on the 8th of May at the Bishopsgate Institute if you want to get involved in No Pride in War, and there's a plan for a demonstration on the 10th of May. And also, we in Gay Liberation have been trying to talk to Pride in London, and we've been trying to do this for about 3 years now, and it's succeeded. And we had a meeting with them a couple of months ago with the chair of Pride, and we made various suggestions, and some of them they're interested in taking up. One was that the comms director wanted a sort of booklet thing which we could produce for every marcher on the parade in 2020, which will be the 50th anniversary of the Gay Liberation Front. And in 2022 will be the 50th anniversary of Pride. So these things are really important that we can influence what's going on. The second thing they're trying to take on board, not for this year, but for next year, is having no motorised vehicles on Pride. And I think that would be a very good thing, because it cuts down on the presence of all the commercial interests that are involved in it. And further than that, we would like to sort of start attacking the people who fund Pride. So there's lots really going on, and you're very welcome to come down. Because we're not meeting at the Bishopsgate Institute on the 8th of May. We'll be at the LSE on the first Wednesday in June. We generally meet at the LSE because they're very proud to have an association with the Liberation Front, because that's where we started meeting in October 1970. There's a presence on Facebook, so please keep in touch and come along to a meeting. I think you'll enjoy it.
Thank you very much. Yes, Karen.
Just a quick announcement. A couple of days ago I did a queer tour of Brixton, which is about the Gay Community Centre and the gay squats in and around Burton Road, Brixton. It's also about all the other radical groups that were in the area as well, like the Race Today Collective. There were 3 women's centres on Railton Road, and there were several other radical groups as well. I'm going to do that tour again on the 20th of June, so if anybody wants to come along, it will be Herne Hill Station, 1 o'clock, 20th of June, queer tour of Brixton.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, Colin.
2 further things. People may have heard of Sarah Shulman, who is an activist and involved in ACT UP in New York. She is going to be in London from the 1st to the 4th of May. She's doing various meetings and events. If you go to queertoursoflondon.com, then you find information there. I think she's talking in particular about a social history of ACT UP that she's writing in particular, and other stuff. The other thing to be aware of is that people may know that there is a campaign around Eurovision, which on the one hand has a big gay following, but this year is in Israel. So there are going to be various alternative events happening around that. I know that the PSC is doing one. I know that London Palestine Action are doing stuff. So if you keep an eye out or you search for those online, then I know that there'll be lots of LGBT involvement in those.
Great, thanks very much. Okay, once again, thank you, everybody. Anybody who wants to continue with the discussion, we'll have a drink. If you go out the door, turn back to Eversholt Street and turn immediate right. There's a pub right there on the corner called the Prince Arthur, and everybody who can come along, that would be great.
Oh, yeah, sure.
School Twitter.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, sure. I believe the response is like running is still at the core. Oh God, my goodness, what a complexity. Can we go for a drink? Yes, yeah, I'll see you more. Okay. So I'm Colin Wilson at yahoo.com, and do get in touch. We're very happy to come and speak with Bertie Fantastic, that's great. Yes,
Is there like some essential books that you recommend?
about Britain,
No, I agree.